Good evening and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. Whether you're here in the theater, joining us on our YouTube station, or a special welcome to those of you joining us on C-SPAN. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening for tonight's discussion, Citizen Engagement in America's History. This program is presented in partnership with the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, and we thank them for their support. Tonight's program is part of the National Archives' ongoing efforts to promote civic education and facilitate historical understanding of our national experience. Through our public programs and educational activities, we offer a wide range of program formats for audiences of adults, children, and educators to educate American citizens about democracy. Before I get started, I'd like to tell you about two other events coming up later this month. Tomorrow at noon, as a Robert F. Kennedy Legacy Program, we will hear from Kerry Kennedy about her new book about her father, Robert F. Kennedy, Ripples of Hope. Using interviews with those who have been inspired by him, Kennedy brings to life RFK's values and passions, and the book signing will follow that program. And then on Tuesday, July 3rd at noon, get a head start on the July 4th celebration with a conversation between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. These two founding fathers, portrayed by Joseph Doyle and Stephen Edenbow, will debate each other and take questions from the audience. And then on the next morning, on July 4th, they'll be on the Constitution Avenue steps, reading the Declaration of Independence. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events at archives.gov. Check out our website or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives education activities. Another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach programs, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. Citizen engagement and civic literacy have long been woven into the work we do here at the National Archives. Our mission statement declares that we strive to cultivate public participation. We firmly believe in the importance of public access to government records and that such access strengthens democracy by allowing Americans to claim their rights of citizenship, hold their government accountable, and understand their history so they can participate more effectively in their government. The records we preserve belong to all Americans, and they have the right to examine them and use them. The Constitution of the United States, which we publicly display in the rotunda, proclaims the primacy of the people in its opening words, "We the people." Another document, Exhibit Records of Rights, has many examples of we the people. How have we have asserted our rights, campaigned for justice, and petitioned our government. All of us at the National Archives take our roles as caretakers of America's records very seriously, and we're proud that the work we do every day preserves our documentary heritage for generations to come. I'll turn you over now to Martin Frost of the United States Association of Former Members of Congress, who will introduce tonight's panelists. Martin Frost served 26 years as a congressman from the 24th District of Texas from 1979 to 2005. During that time, he served 8 years in the House Democratic leadership, 4 years as chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and 4 years as chair of the House Democratic Caucus. He was a member of the House Rules Committee and the House Budget Committee. Since leaving Congress, he served 4 years as chair of the National Endowment for Democracy and is the incoming president of the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. He's an adjunct professor in the George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management and holds journalism and history degrees from the University of Missouri and a law degree from Georgetown. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Martin Frost.
Well, thank you, David. It's good to be back. We, the former members of Congress, in partnership with the Archives, has a series of events like this, and y'all have been great to help us put these on, and I think people here tonight will find it interesting, both people watching it, streaming it online, and people here in the audience. Before we hear from the truly outstanding panelists who volunteered their time to share their personal stories of civic engagement with you tonight, I'd like to share a quick word about our association, the former members of Congress. As FMC, we bring together a bipartisan group of over 600 former representatives and senators who work together in a bipartisan manner on a wide variety of projects. Our mission strengthens the work of the current Congress by promoting collaborative approaches to policymaking while deepening understanding of our democratic system and encouraging public service. As an association, we've become extremely concerned about the lack of civic education in this country. Whether you agree or disagree with our panelists on the issues they advocate, their engagement as citizens is based on civic education they've learned, and especially the engagement we see from our guests today. I'm going to walk through the who's on the panel, and then they'll all come in at once. And our panel will look to examine how, from civil rights to Parkland, individuals from different generations, backgrounds, and platforms have taken a stand on issues near and dear to their hearts, all while becoming active and vocal citizens. We ask that our audience respect that discussion. We'll focus on the issues of civic learning and engagement, not about particular issues like gun control or race relations. It is in the interest of time, and given how large our panel is this evening, we've asked you to write down any questions you may have for our panelists on note cards provided for you. Staff members will circle the auditorium and collect those questions later in the program. Finally, if what our panelists share tonight resonates with you in any way, I encourage you to visit the former members of Congress website and find out more about our programming. Now, having said that, it is my great pleasure to recognize the moderator for tonight's discussion, former Congressman from California, Jane Harman, one of the truly outstanding members of Congress that I served with. Jane became the first woman director, president, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center after serving 9 terms in the House of Representatives. Her dedication to public service is exemplary. She served in President Carter's administration, was a member of the House Armed Services, Homeland Security, and Intelligence Committees, and is recognized worldwide as an expert on security and public policy issues. Jane will be tonight's guide during our conversation on how citizens of our country have helped shape our democracy. Joining her are tonight's panelists. Washington's D.C. delegate in the House of Representatives, Eleanor Holmes Norton, will be one of those panelists. Congressman Norton, in addition to having served 14 terms in the House of Representatives, came into public life as a civil rights and feminist leader and a tenured professor of law. A third-generation Washingtonian, she spent her legal career arguing cases protecting women's rights, civil rights, and free speech. Also on the panel will be former Congressman Tim Petri, who represented Wisconsin's 6th Congressional District for 18 terms. That's a long time, folks, until his retirement from the U.S. House of Representatives at the end of the 113th Congress. He was a senior member of both the Transportation and Infrastructure Committees and the Committee on Education and Workforce, known for his innovative, creative solutions to government problems. Representative Petri pursued legislative initiatives in several areas, including student loan reform, the federal highway program, cost sharing for federal water projects, tax and welfare reform, and health care. And he will bring the perspective of a long-term Republican member of Congress who had to face the same type of lobbying that Democratic members face in dealing with issues facing our country. Then, of course, is Sarah Lerner, who's a teacher at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. She teaches English, journalism, and advises the yearbook. This is Sarah's 16th year of teaching, having taught at Lyons Middle School, South Plantation High School previously. She has been a Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School since 2014. Sarah has received honors from the Florida Scholastic Press Association, the Southern Interscholastic Press Association, National Scholastic Press Association, as well as the Columbia Scholastic Press Association. The four yearbooks Sarah has produced at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School have all been nationally recognized. They have also been entered into the Walsworth Gallery of Excellence. As we all know, she historically watched over 15 students in a locked classroom when a gunman attacked her school last February. And then, last but not least, is Rain Valadares, who just finished her junior year at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. Rain has been on the yearbook staff for the past 3 years and has been photo editor the last 2 years. As a senior, she will continue as photo editor and become the editor-in-chief. Along with her work as yearbook editor, Rain has taken 5 advanced placement classes, has been involved in National Honor Society, Teen Trendsetters, and the Spanish Club. She plans to study photojournalism in college. The photographs Rain made of her classmates in the hours before the attack on her school are simply stunning and have received national attention. It is my privilege to have you all on the stage with us this evening, so please join us in welcoming this outstanding panel as they enter the hall. That's you.
He's disappeared. I hope the mic is on. Can everybody hear me? Good evening. I'm Jane Harmon, and this is an exciting panel. And I gather we will be joined a little bit later by Congressman Ted Deutsch from the Parkland district. And if he comes, and if he wants to, we're going to add him to our little happy group, because he has stories, obviously, to tell, too. Let me just make a few opening comments, and then you'll hear, I think, an amazingly interesting set of stories from activists who were and are extremely effective. And the last speaker will be Tim Petri, and just to warn you, as a former member of Congress, too, he will talk about the ways in which Congress receives information or doesn't receive information, and some of the lessons learned. So it's a pleasure to participate in an event with the National Archives. I'm sure you've all been here. I was realizing how long it's been since I've been here, but the documents in this place show us all why this democratic, with a small d, experiment in America has been so successful and is so important. And similarly, Congress is part of that experiment. And as the Article 1 branch of government, there are 3 branches of government. Article 1 is Congress, Article 2 is the executive, and Article 3 is the courts. Article 1 means that Congress really has to be first, has to lead. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, but these stories will help illuminate some of the better times in the United States Congress. I would say, and I don't know that, I hope I don't offend my dear friend Eleanor, this is not one of Congress's better times. That has nothing to do with her personal ability, which is enormous, but it does have to do with the ability of the institution as an institution to get things done. So toxic partisanship is a big problem, and I think we all pay a price for that, including the people who work there. But we'll tell some of the good stories tonight. The way we will do this, and Martin said this, is within a historical context. So we will start with Eleanor's stories, not because she may be one of the a person with more life experience on the stage, along with Tim and me, but because she was in, I didn't mess that up too bad, but because in terms of timing, the activism that she first engaged in before she ran for Congress, and still engages in, came first. So we'll go into that. We will then, I may ask a few questions along the way, and then we are taking written questions from you, which will be given to me, and I will be happy to ask them. Just a few more points. One, the importance of bipartisanship. You know, though I'm a Democrat, I have always called myself a charter member of the bipartisan party, since what mattered to me, and I think what mattered to all of us in Congress, was putting the country first. And sadly, the business model of Congress now doesn't do that. It's not the people. Very good people serve in Congress, in my view, in both parties. and very good staff serves in Congress in both parties. But the problem is that the goal of the business model, rather than solving problems, is to blame the other side for not solving problems. And as a bipartisan here, I will say that both parties play this game, and the country loses. And if you are bipartisan these days, that means you get a primary challenge. And it's very unfortunate for all of us that seems to be the model. And all of us can change it if we are active, this is the point, and pitch the right messages to the right people in both parties. And I think we're going to learn that. Congress also is not, I would say, a learning institution. Why is that? Because people are too busy. I was visiting a senior member of the Senate today, and he said, "Thanks for coming up here. I don't have time to learn about this issue." And the issue I was talking about, you might be interested, was about a summit that was convened by the Trump administration last June, a year ago. Vice President Pence went, and John Kelly, who was then the Secretary of Homeland Security, went, as did the head of, Luis Moreno, the head of the Inter-American Development Bank, and some others. The summit was held in Florida, and the point of this summit was to figure out how the United States could help the governments of the Central American countries, which are the drivers of this migration through Mexico into the United States. That was, as we all know, that's been the top of the news for the last weeks. And the Trump administration had a good idea. Invest in developing political capacity in these countries, help reduce corruption and crime from the drug cartels, and stimulate business investment in these countries. Why wouldn't that be a good idea? Who would be against that? Nobody. And actually, Congress funds some of that. However, this summit occurred a year ago, and there was a report with recommendations, and no one is focusing on it. So I went to see a senior member of the Senate to suggest that perhaps this person, who has jurisdiction over some aspects of Latin America in his role on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, might hold a hearing or come down to the Wilson Center, this nonpartisan think tank that I had, and address this issue. It just hasn't been addressed. It should be focused on. It certainly, if done right, and it was the administration's initiative, it certainly would add some value and help the country solve a very serious problem. So this evening, as you heard from Martin Frost, we are not debating the merits of the various issues you'll hear about. We are probing the advocacy that was behind presenting these issues to Congress, and how those who advocated effectively did it, and how perhaps what they did would have to be done a little differently in this century than it was done in the last century. So we'll start with Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, whom I met in her advocacy days way back when. And I just make a point. I think Martin was saying that there are 600 former members of Congress. Did you know that since the beginning of time, there have been about 10,500 members of Congress? And guess how many of them were female? Under 500. That is still the current statistic. So it is with great pride that I would like to welcome one of my former sisters, Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Jane.
And the question, Eleanor, is you were a civil rights advocate in various guises. What turned you on to the issues, plural? What did you do? And how do you, looking back on your own activism, how do you measure your effectiveness?
Well, it's important to recognize that Congress is not a self-executing body. That puts a great burden on the citizens. If you want anything done through law in your country. Now, I'm a native Washingtonian, a third-generation Washingtonian. Grew up in the city, was one of the last graduates of a segregated school system because Brown versus Board of Education came just as I was graduating from Dunbar High School. So my own experience with segregation, not only discrimination, everything was segregated in your nation's capital, except the buses, downtown in the department stores. African Americans couldn't try on clothes. This was a southern city. So having grown up with segregation, I was really ready for the civil rights movement. So a lot has to do with your moment in time. And I was going to college just as the civil rights movement was bursting forward, particularly as a student movement. I was a member of what was known as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So the civil rights movement had about 6 major organizations, of which SNCC is one. My colleague, John Lewis, and I were both in SNCC at the same time. So it gives me great joy to see students, even younger than we were, taking the initiative on a major issue in our country, and I must say, given their age, high school students, the first time I have ever seen high school students essentially start a national movement. We in SNCC were a part of an overall movement. I mean, there was the NAACP, there were any number of organizations. We had the March on Washington that was led by adults. What happened in Parkland, Florida is very different. These students came to Washington and had a big demonstration. They were in charge. They have stimulated one of the toughest issues to get the Congress to focus on. In fact, if I may say so, I can think of no tougher issue. And yet, if you had a pen and you pricked it, you really ought to be able to do something about it. For example, and there are very few statistics like this, about 97% of the American people are for background checks for guns. So that's not hard. It says something, though, about the way our country was set up, that it is hard to get even easy things done. And the way our country was set up by founders who didn't much believe that the central government could do very much was to make it difficult for the central government to do very much. And that was back then in the 18th century and 19th century. But when you have to pass bills, unlike the way bills are passed in Europe, in a parliamentary system where whoever runs the government makes the laws, has the majority, if you have a wholly different system that says even if you want to get a bill where 97% of the American people are for you, you've got to go through the House, you've got to go through the Senate. They each have cumbersome rules, and then you've got to get the president to sign it. There is something new on the scene, and that is this student movement. And essentially the challenge to the House of Representatives where I serve is, can they get the Congress to do what nobody before them has been able to do? They have shown longevity. They haven't just had a demonstration here and got everybody excited. So I would answer that question, even given how difficult it is to get things done in Congress, that the students led by the Parkland, Florida students will show the country that young people can make the old-fashioned Congress do something important in our country, and that is pass common sense gun safety laws. I very much thank them for their leadership.
Appreciate that, but you were pretty effective too. We're going to hear from the Parkland teacher and student in a minute. But Eleanor, back in the day, John Lewis and you and others were extraordinary leaders at a young age for Congress to do something about racial discrimination. And Congress actually did a lot about racial discrimination back in the day. A president, Lyndon Johnson, particularly cared about this. I remember this. And in the early 70s, I was a staffer in the Senate. I was the chief counsel of the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, and we were able to extend and expand the Voting Rights Act. And it was tricky, procedurally tricky, because the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time, Jim Eastland of Mississippi, was an avowed segregationist. But we didn't do this by ourselves. There was enormous pressure from outside. So when in your SNCC days, and then later you were the head of the Equal Opportunity Commission, what did you do then to get Congress to move?
Well, as a young person with segregation still in place, you mentioned the Voting Rights Act. There's also, that's the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
Yep.
There's the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I got through college and in time to head the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that I was in the streets trying to get. And there was the 1968 Fair Housing Act. So
yes, so you were in the streets. I mean, it was a different
streets.
time.
In the streets.
And you took enormous personal risks. I mean, walking across the Pettus Bridge, I think most people know that story. John, were you there when John Lewis was
I didn't walk across the Pettus Bridge.
He got his head beat in.
I was among the students who sat in. We didn't.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want you to think that the risks were very great. If they were so great, we were young and foolish enough not to regard sitting in a place that you weren't supposed to be as a risk. And that does say something about our country, that even with segregation in place, we believe that we would somehow survive what we call nonviolent resistance. So I have enormous, the Parkland students are far more sophisticated. They have something we didn't have, social media. I mean, I'm on every social media platform. I'm on every social media platform, and there wasn't any such thing. So imagine what they're going to be able to do with this issue that we had to do by putting our bodies on the line and saying, okay, you got to arrest me, because that's the only way I can make a point.
How did you, not everybody did what you did, even people growing up in this segregated town or in the segregated South, who were the victims of discrimination, wouldn't necessarily put their bodies at risk. I mean, what motivated you personally to do this? How did you have the courage to do it?
Well, I really think growing up in the nation's capital, a segregated city, and understand it was a city where black people worked in the bowels of the government, but that meant they had to have some college education. Yeah. So that there was some great consciousness if you grew up in this city. I am the great-great-granddaughter of a runaway slave from Virginia. Amazing. And that consciousness, which is replicated among African Americans in the district, people who had a high consciousness did not live in the Old South, which would have been even more risky, but lived in the nation's capital. So in a real sense, I just could not wait for the civil rights movement. I was ready for it before it happened. And that has a lot to do with growing up in the city where we are now in the nation's capital.
But it has a lot to do with activism. You could not wait. And you had great opportunities. You went to Yale Law School, do I remember this right? So you had, this fancy law degree. You probably, well, back in the day, I remember this, women lawyers weren't getting a lot of job offers. But you probably had a cushy option, and instead, you chose activism.
No, but by that time, the civil rights might have already been in the civil rights. That's why I say young and foolish. By that time, I had already been in the civil rights movement.
Not letting her off the hook. What she did was very courageous, and I'm sure everyone agrees with me. And we will talk about this issue too. But when you did it,
what had not been done? There had not been an activist movement since the labor movement, and that was before I was born. So the country was not used to seeing people get up on their hind legs and demand something and expect to get some response. Who does that? Who does that are people who are desperate enough so they really don't have many other options. And who does it first? And I think that's an important point to bear in mind. It is not unusual for activism to begin among the very young. Not people who have children, people who have responsibilities, but people who, if you will forgive me, have nothing to lose, and who make it possible for the rest of us to have everything to gain. So I was born at the right time to be in such a generation, and it has helped me prepare for everything else I have done in my life.
There we go.
Including run for Congress.
And if you hadn't done all this crazy stuff, maybe you wouldn't have had the gumption to run for Congress, which is a pretty big move in case anybody missed it. It's, you put yourself out there, even if you have a Yale degree and somebody comes up and feels very comfortable saying, I don't like you, I don't want you. And it's not exactly a warm and fuzzy experience to be merchandise and have people have opinions that may not be based on your merit. Then some other people probably love you, and you may not deserve that either. But my point is, it's a brave thing to do, to be an activist. It is a brave thing to do, and you were very effective at it. And then you parlayed that into an extremely long, so far, political career, where you are also out there doing brave things. And so I just think we're going to move on here, but I just personally want to salute you for an
Thank
amazing
you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to talk to Sarah and Rain. Oh, there he is. This is Peter Deutsch, Congressman Peter Deutsch. He can add
Ted Deutsch.
There's another Peter Deutsch. Congressman Ted Deutsch, whom I know well and just messed up his name.
Peter Deutsch
Well,
does a band,
in my
I think.
defense, this guy Petri used to be Tom Petri, and now he's Tim Petri, so I deserve to be confused. Anyway, hi, Ted.
Hi, Jen.
Ted is the congressman for Sarah and Rain, and we're going to hear their stories. And now that you're here, we're delighted you're here. I wish you'd comment on them. What we're trying to talk about is activism. Where does it come from, and how do you do it effectively? And we are addressing the gun safety issue, but we're not debating the gun safety issue. We're discussing activism. And as Eleanor was saying before you got here, it was an astonishingly impressive performance. Performance is not fair. An astonishingly impressive act from the heart of students and teachers who went through an absolutely horrific experience, not the first and not the last in our country, but the most recent horrific experience. So I don't know which one of you wants to start, but please talk about not just the incident and what you did, but how you personally. Well, let's start with you, Sarah, because you're the one who barricaded yourself in the room and saved a bunch of kids. How'd you do that?
Well, it was a normal Wednesday at school. I was giving a quiz to my seniors in my English class, and the fire alarm went off, and we all kind of looked at each other in confusion because we had just had a fire drill in the morning. So they were taking a quiz on 1984, very happy to leave the room. I'm like, all right, let's go. So I grabbed my phone and my keys. We went outside, and I had about 25 students with me. And we heard what sounded like firecrackers. And then I saw people running and knew it couldn't have been firecrackers. So I got back upstairs to my classroom. I ended up with 5 from my class. Everyone else had kind of just scattered like cockroaches. And I had 10 come to me from the classroom next door because their teacher, who's a friend of mine, had gone to another classroom for safety. And I let them in, I locked the door, and we sat in the room and we waited and waited and waited. And we were in the room for about 2.5 hours until the SWAT team came in. 8 very large, very nice, but very large armed men, let themselves into my classroom. And I mean, I'm 38 now. I was 37 when it happened. I realize I look like I'm 12, but I had to identify myself as the teacher in the classroom. And I, had to open the closet so they could see what was inside, and then we grabbed whatever belongings they would allow us to grab and kind of serpentine through campus to avoid the building and, go a different route. And we made it off campus. We were kind of shuttle bussed to a local hotel where we met with police and FBI. I gave my statement, and then I met up with my husband and my son. My parents had my daughter.
Was your son at the same school?
My son is just finished 6th grade. He's in the middle school next door. So while I'm sitting in my classroom, once I realized what was going on, I sent a text to my husband and to my mom. There's an active shooter on campus. I'm okay. And then maybe 5-10 minutes later, my son texted me, Mom, I'm scared. What's going on? We're on lockdown. So to have to tell your 12-year-old son, I'm okay, I'm not shot, is horrible. No one should ever have to say that at all. But, he had never been on a lockdown before. And, I needed to assure him that I was okay and I was safe and he was where he needed to be and he was in the safest place. Listen to your teacher, just do what you need to do. I'm okay, and then anyone who's ever had my phone number was texting me. Most of the information I was receiving was coming from the outside. That's how I found out that he had been apprehended. I didn't know. All I had with me was my cell phone. My computer was on my desk on the other side of the room, and trying to get information and piece things together. I didn't understand the full scope of what was happening for hours, days to come.
But you certainly understood that 15 people in your charge were depending on you to do the right things, and you did the right things.
Yeah.
Yeah. But okay, that was that horrible day, and with your own kids, I absolutely can imagine, because I have 4 children. One of them was in school here on 9/11, and I was a fairly senior member of Congress then, trying to reach her on my cell phone and could not because the cell towers had crashed, and it was terrifying, just absolutely terrifying. So that was day 1. Since then, I don't know how many days it's been. I bet you all do. How many days has it been?
I don't know the exact count, but it's over 4 months.
Okay. But for 4 months, now you are an activist on this issue. And how did you decide on day 2 and day 3 that you were not just going to have done the right thing on day 1, but that you were now going to be active about this issue?
I've always been very politically aware and very politically active in my own right. Very much a feminist, always looking out for human rights. And when everything happened, I knew, as a journalism teacher and a journalist, I had a responsibility to do right by my students and our community. I've lived in Coral Springs, which is the neighboring town, since 1995. I'm a product of the Broward County school system. So I know these kids. I am one of these kids. Right. So I needed to do right by them. And I've been very active on Twitter for years, really just posting about food and my kids and funny things, like stupid memes. I used to be hilarious on Twitter, and now it's very serious political stuff. Right. But I knew that, for the handful of people who were following me, they were seeing what I was saying, and I didn't take that responsibility lightly. Beyond that, as the yearbook advisor and a journalism teacher, I had to, whenever we would go back to school, I had to finish out the year, and I had to teach my journalism kids, and we were in the middle of our social media unit when everything happened, and I had a yearbook to finish when everything happened. So I knew that I needed to work on things at school with the students, as far as social media and the journalism end of things. But I have strong feelings too, and I had things that I wanted to say. And the day after the incident, I cannot tell you, I felt like I was on a media tour. I cannot tell you how many reporters and shows and radio podcasts I did, and the day before, I was just a regular mom teacher in Florida, and now MSNBC is calling, CNN is calling, I was on NPR. Like, I just felt like I was all over the place because of what happened, but I was using that to start to make change. I didn't think of myself as an activist at that moment, but I knew something needed to change.
But you became that. You stepped into the moment, just the way Eleanor did. Different set of circumstances, but not really. Bad stuff happened. She's there. She has a reason to be hurt by that bad stuff, and she had the courage, the personal courage, and the passion to get in the moment. So let's turn to Rain, because for you this has to be even harder. You're still in high school, and your classmates were killed and wounded. Our condolences, obviously, to them. And I'm sure you knew them. And what was it like for you, and what helped you? Because it's, you'd think, I mean, I can't imagine at your age whether I would have I wouldn't have had the composure that you have.
Well, first off, thank you. Well, I like to start off talking about the beginning of that day. It was Valentine's Day, as we all know. And I don't like to forget that it was Valentine's Day, because the day started out to be a great day. It was Valentine's Day. And being a photo editor, being in yearbook, I took the duty of taking Valentine's Day pictures. And I was at lunch, and I was taking pictures of Emma Gonzalez. I don't know if you guys know that name. But she had a table set up with the Gay Straight Alliance Club. She started giving out love proclamations, these little slips of paper, and you could just sign your name. And while I was taking pictures of her, one of my best friends, Lila, she's also in yearbook, she signed like Lila and then put my name, Rain. This is my proclamation of love. Silly things like that. And it was just really lighthearted, and people were giving out flowers. And before we left lunch, I saw a close friend of mine. Her name is Victoria Tori Gonzalez. And the Best Buddies Club at our school, they sell $1 Valentine's Day gifts. And I saw her just buying a gift for her, well, I can't say boyfriend because she doesn't like the word boyfriend, because she refers to him as her soulmate.
It's high school, hey.
No, it was never, they could never say boyfriend and girlfriend. They were just like, oh, no, that's not, because it's,
Okay.
They said it was so much more than that. Her boyfriend, was Joaquin, Guac, Oliver. Sorry if I get emotional.
Okay.
And, sorry. So I took those pictures, and I just held on to them, and I went back upstairs to the yearbook room, finished my lunch, and that was it. And on my way to fourth period, I saw one of my other friends, Natasha, also in yearbook. She was coming up to me, and she was about to give me a hug, and I was just like, say cheese. And I took a picture of her. She was holding a heart balloon, and it was just, that was the day. Like, I was stressed out because I had to do an essay after school, and that was my biggest worry. And I was just like, oh my God, how am I going to do that? Like, I had to make everything up. And the teacher that Ms. Lerner is referring to, who had to leave her classroom to seek safety, that was my teacher. I was right next to Ms. Lerner, right next door. So my teacher, she's my AP environmental teacher. Her name's Tammy Aurelio. She had the door open because she's environmental, she wants air. And I heard, actually, David Hogg is in my class, by the way. In the front, he was sitting in the front. He was like, oh, Ms. Aurelio, did you hear that? And I was sitting in the back, and I wasn't paying attention. There was 20 minutes left of school. I was just like, let's go. And then just a split second after he said that, the fire alarm went off. Yeah. We go down the stairs, and then just as she explained, pops went off. But I kind of disappointed myself because I did not react quick enough, because I was in such denial for such a long time, not just then, but hours after it even happened. I turned around and I looked at my teacher. I was just, where do I go? And I kept walking straight, and Chef Kurth, the culinary teacher, she just dragged all of us in, even 2 other teachers. And there was about almost 30, 40, I can't even remember.
65 in a classroom.
And we were all just crammed there. And I remember a girl in the back was having a panic attack. She couldn't breathe. And I remember Chef Kurth coming in and saying, don't worry, it's just a drill. So I just calmed myself down. I was like, guys, it's fine. We're going to be fine. But then slowly I started getting text messages. And then I got one from Natasha, who I took a picture of, saying that one of our friends, who's also in yearbook, named Isabel Checker, Issa, that she got shot. At first I was just like, this isn't what? But then I started getting calls from my family. I got a call from my brother, who also attends the school. He's a senior. He ran. He was one of the first kids who ran. And just the desperation in his voice, it stunned me so much in that I didn't know. I was just telling him, it's a drill, it's a drill. It's still in denial. And then my parents call me. And then I'm talking to my mom, and I'm saying I'm fine. And then I say, my friend Isabel got shot. And my mom is asking me, is she going to be okay? And I paused because I didn't know. I didn't know anything, and I started crying because that's when it kind of finally hit me. We spent some more time there just sitting for hours, and one student takes out a laptop he has, and he turns it on to the news. And we see footage of kids coming out, and it says at least 22 injured. Still in denial, all of us. They said, oh, that's probably kids injured because they started running and they got trampled on, and we're just like, it's fine. And then they started comparing this to Columbine. And we were like, Columbine? That can't be true. Time still goes by, and eventually a SWAT team comes in. I run out of school, and I walk towards my mom, and we go home. Going back to social media, it was the first thing I did when I went back home. I tweeted out, I said, I am so heartbroken, I don't know what's happening. I love you guys, like, just to everyone. And then I just started seeing more and more footage. My friends, videos of my friends kneeling, and it was just horrifying. And then hearing the constant updates. So-and-so is missing, so-and-so is injured. I didn't contact one of my best friends just because everything was happening so fast. And she's actually one of my close neighbors. And I went to her doorstep because I was just like, is Maddie okay? And I knocked on her door. There was no answer. I looked around, like, I saw there was lights. I was just confused. But then I went back, and I was like, she's probably fine. She's probably also confused, and same as I am. I go back on Twitter, and I refresh my feed, and the first thing I see is a picture of Maddie with her mom. Sorry, again. And it's a post from a family friend of Maddie saying, please pray for Maddie. She got shot 3 times, and she needs to undergo surgeries. But then later that night, I also learned she was shot 3 times through her stomach and lung. She broke 5 ribs and shattered 3 of them, and 1 bullet went through her arm, straight out. But then I also started texting her mom, and I said, is she okay? Is she going to be okay? And they said that the doctors expected a full recovery. So going back to how I took photos that day, a week after everything happened, we had an orientation where we went back to school to receive our belongings that we left in the classroom and talk with our teachers and our friends and our principal. I had left my camera in my bag because I wasn't going to run with it, and I didn't know what to do. And the first thing I did was look at the pictures I took. So you say activism, and I think there's so many different ways to be an activist. There's ways to tweet, speak out, art, and I used my art, my craft, photography as my way of protest almost. And I posted those photos of them that day, and it got a lot of attention on Twitter. And people realized the innocence that we had in all of us that day and how it was just ripped away from us. And I always compare that event to just saying it's a huge before and after in my life, and those photos were my last account of the before. And I'm really proud of my peers, and none of us expected this. I felt like the first day was just complete confusion. The next day was grief, filled with grief. But then with this whole never again thing trending, I didn't know what was going on. They sent out like remind texts. Everyone tweet never again at 3 o'clock. I was just like, okay, I'll do it. I tweeted at 3:07. I was like, oh my God, I'm late, but it's okay. I didn't know, because I didn't know what it was trying to do. But then it started just gaining so much. It was just a huge snowball effect that everyone started getting in on this. and then it just turned into a march, and then now I'm here, and then like, it's just the support, not just from our school and our community, just the entire country. I don't even have any words.
But well, two things. Social media, which didn't exist when Eleanor was an early activist, has its own momentum. But second of all, I think everyone feels, and I'm going to ask Ted if he agrees with this, that the poise and the amazing strength of the Parkland kids is what led this. Not just followed this, but led this. And the march here, as I remember, reading about it, was funded by some big shots. But smartly, or maybe the kids asked for this, they weren't in the forefront, the kids were. And the people on the stage were the kids. And the power of this was because, first of all, you all experienced it, the horror of it. But second of all, you were brave. You put yourselves out there, not just through, using computers and all that and hashtag this and that and what, but in a different form from the way Eleanor did it, but as effectively. The faces of this were your faces, right?
Yeah, I think just as much as people want to tweet something or write something online, it means that much more showing up.
That's right.
Then it just shows how much you're willing to go, how far you're willing to go to continue your message, not only start
And you've
it.
answered that question.
Yeah.
You're willing to go as far as you need to go. So Ted, I do know what your name is, Ted. You were the member of Congress for Parkland.
Yeah.
And where were you? And what role have you played in either being part of the activism or receiving the activism? And how was the institution? We're going next to Tim, and he's going to talk about how Congress receives information, comma. Well, and ... But what role have you played in this, and are you playing? Not to debate the issue, but in the activism of the kids.
Right. Well, first, it's great to be here, and there have been many opportunities that I've had to share a stage, a platform, a classroom with teachers and students. And every time it's an honor. Look, I was, and by the way, just to spend a moment of talking about our guests, there were a lot of heroes on February 14th, and this was such a horrific tragedy, and the activism that sprung out of it has been so inspiring, and I'll talk about that. We sometimes don't pause to reflect upon, even in the midst of that awful day, the heroism that was on display all over that school, and there is no better example of that than Sarah. So, so thank you for that. So I was, just really quickly, I was here. I was in a foreign affairs hearing and got a text from my deputy district director, whose daughter's a student at Stoneman Douglas, just telling me that that her daughter was locked herself in a closet in the band room because there was an active shooter on campus. I jumped out of my chair, ran into the anteroom, called the sheriff, who had just come out of the school, and I will never forget, he said, I asked him, because there wasn't much that had been reported yet on the news, and I asked him about what he had seen, and he just said, Congressman, it's as bad as you can possibly imagine. And so I did everything I could to get a flight home. I got home that night and was at the school the next day. I was actually, just when you speak of activism, I was at the school about 2 weeks before the shooting, speaking to the politics club and journalists, and I did an interview with high school television reporter David Hogg, which I'd still like to see, actually.
We have a spread about it in the yearbook.
Okay, good, thanks. And a bunch of the kids that have now become these household names have it came out that day just to talk about being involved in the community. So I got home and went to Parkland to be with the community, and I could tell immediately that this was different. First of all, we knew it was different because I knew the kind of school, I knew the kind of community that Coral Springs and Parkland are. I know the kids and teachers at the school. They weren't just going to let this fall by the wayside as just one more horrific school shooting. They were going to do something about it. So there was a rally, there was a vigil the next night, but earlier in that afternoon, 24 hours to the minute from the shooting, the students gathered at the same park and had a moment of silence, and it was very moving. And afterward, several of the students came up to me and described what they experienced and what they saw, and just grabbed my arm and said, "Congressman, we can't just let this happen again. We have to do something." Right. And they've been doing something about it literally every day since. And I had the privilege of being there at the Never Again headquarters at someone's dining room table, because these are, after all, high school kids, right? Sitting around the table after they had just gotten off the phone. One of them had just spoken with Justin Bieber, and another way that everyone wanted to chime in and be helpful. And the reason that they've been so incredible and so inspiring, and you could tell by the way Rain presented herself and her story tonight, is that there is nothing more happening here than people who experience something that is just incomprehensible to the rest of us, and decided to do something about it in the most genuine way. The reason that they're so successful is because they're so real. There's no putting on a show. It is 100% based on who they are and what they've experienced.
And they don't back down. They don't go away. They stay at it. I mean, that's another part that they didn't necessarily have to do, but they're doing it.
No, and they started immediately. There were a number of students who came up here the week after the shooting, and we took them around to Capitol Hill, and they met literally hundreds of members of Congress, because it didn't matter what your politics were. You could not refuse a meeting with students who had just experienced it. You couldn't say no. So I'm not going to make this a debate, but I'm just going to describe something that happened. There's nothing quite like seeing some of your young constituents sit around the table with a member of the leadership of the House of Representatives who was very kind to them and engaged with them. And then they laid out what they were trying to accomplish. And this member took out a copy of the pocket Constitution and started reading the Second Amendment and explaining the Second Amendment. Only in response did we then see one of the students pull out his own copy of the pocket Constitution and explain why even the decision in the Heller case leaves room for what they were trying to do. It was incredible. And then we went, and this is the last thing I'll say about this. We did a rally out at Blair High School, and Representative Raskin, on very short notice, helped pull this thing together. There were about 1,000 students. Jamie was there, I was there, the principal, and maybe a teacher or two. Everyone else in the room was a student, a high school student. Everyone.
That's the magic.
And they stood, and I've never seen anything like these students. You had a group from Parkland, you had a group from Maryland and DC and Virginia, all sitting on stage together, and they took turns going back and forth, where one would say, "We're going to be the generation that ends gun violence," and the next would say, "We're going to be the generation that brings change. We're going to be the generation that leads everyone to vote." And every time they did it, there was this roar from the crowd. It was incredible. And then it was the next day that, a week later, that the big event, the big town hall meeting took place. And look, the reason that I think this really took off is because there was this nationally televised town hall meeting that gave the world the opportunity to see what this community was like, what these students were like, the fact that they were willing to say things that lots of people may think, but nobody would ever think of saying on national TV. And it came from such a powerfully genuine place that then propelled this movement. The march and what they're doing now, going from city to city to register voters, is remarkable.
Correct. Well, let me let Tim get into this conversation, and we've got to get to questions, so you will have time.
Okay.
So, Tim, you were a member of Congress for a long time, as we all are, and you are a Republican who, I'll vouch for him, he's a wonderful Republican.
I'm in trouble now.
Yeah, this better be good, Tim. You've seen a lot of this. You weren't in Congress for this particular chapter, but you've seen a lot of this. What are your thoughts about, and maybe you personally were an activist, or are, and what are your thoughts about this? And what kinds of messages did you receive? I mean, what were the messages that moved you during your long congressional career? And who were the messengers conveying those messages?
Well, let me just say one or two things really quickly. First of all, this is all occurring in a context which it's worth mentioning, and that is the Constitution that you talked about. And we're very fortunate in this country that we do have the right to petition our government and the freedom of association, and you're exercising both of those rights. And you might even, one of these days, get people giving you contributions and engage someone who will petition the government professionally for you, called a lobbyist, which has a bad reputation.
Or they may be in Congress themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, these kids are impressive.
But we all belong to associations in America, and we all, but of course, they don't all have the same views. And where we serve, it's called the People's House. And there's a reason for that. The focus of each representative is very much on the national issues and so on and so forth, but also on how it's going to affect the people in their district and what they think of it and how they're going to react. And one of the difficulties with an issue such as the one we've been discussing is that it has very broad general support, but that does not translate into, has not historically translated into votes, whereas the narrow percentage of people does translate into votes. And therefore, people are not only listening to the majority, they're listening to the depth of concern as well. And so well, I could give examples of that. I don't know if I should, but maybe I will. One of them, of our colleagues, Peter Smith from Vermont, was a moderate Republican, voted for moderate gun control legislation. He was defeated by Bernie Sanders, who was a socialist running, and Bernie opposed Peter on the gun issue. And it turned out that liberals were not willing to vote for a moderate Republican who supported them on the gun issue, but the conservative gun owners were willing to vote for a socialist who supported them on that issue. And so that...
This is a revelation for a lot of people in the crowd.
Yeah,
this is
talked about in politics. It makes a big difference. So if you could collect the signatures of 5,000 or 10,000 people in a congressional district of people who said that they had been voting Democratic, but they would vote for a Republican who supported you on that issue, you might pick up a few people across the aisle. But in fact, it's turned out that the people who for a whole variety of reasons support gun rights, for them it's a very deep issue in many cases, and it will influence their vote. Whereas people who support gun control have a lot of other issues, and when push comes to shove and it gets right down to voting, it's not historically translated into votes. And people have discovered that in the political process. Jim Moran from Virginia and I were in England talking with college students there, and at every issue, every forum, this issue came up, and they couldn't understand American gun laws. And we had voted differently. I represented a rural district. I actually did a poll once in my district, and 80% of the people were in favor of some sort of gun control. But the 20%, for them it was a huge issue, and the 80% were for it, but they weren't going to vote on the basis of that issue. So this is the kind of a thing that makes issues like this difficult and frustrating. And of course, it's all, as you know, I mean, there are a variety of, it's not really only guns, for example. It's mental health. It's a whole variety of issues that are involved in something like this. But it certainly would be helpful if we could, if you work hard and you can develop a consensus around doing something positive in this area.
So I think that's very helpful. I was remembering as you spoke that my first term in Congress was 1992, the so-called Year of the Woman. Imagine that. But that was the time when the number of women in the House, here come the questions, doubled, not from a very big number to a still small number, but when 2 senators were elected who happened to be women from California. I think that was the first time. And they were Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer. Dianne is still there, and in 1993, she authored the assault weapons ban, which was a bill to ban civilian ownership of assault weapons for 10 years. And it passed the House. I don't know whether any Republicans voted for it. I don't remember that. But the result of that vote, plus one other vote for a budget that President Clinton, who was then president, proposed, was that the Democrats lost the House, lost the majority. And Tom Foley, who was then the Speaker of the House and came from a fairly rural Washington district and who supported this assault weapons ban, lost his own personal election. I mean, it was a big deal. The people on the other side of the issue mobilized and took him out. And I don't know whether his district was overwhelmingly Democrat or it wasn't, but anyway, Foley lost. Newt Gingrich became the Speaker, and 10 years later, when this bill expired, it wasn't renewed. So the assault weapons ban no longer exists. And let me just make one other comment, and we'll go to these questions. This is really good. I was remembering, for some of us, the 60s, not just the activism around civil rights, but the fact that President Kennedy, who was the motivation for me to enter politics later, but I actually literally went to the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 1960. I was a kid, and I grew up in LA, public school kid, went to the convention, got on the floor, saw him nominated, and was an usher of sorts at his acceptance speech, and that's when I fell in love with politics. But he was assassinated in 1963, brutal event for the country. And then in 1968, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated, and there just was a lot of TV footage about the Kennedy assassination and the fact that the country came out and stood on the train tracks as his body was moved from New York, where his funeral was, to Washington, where he's buried. So, you know, growing up through this, your experience was more personal, but this felt pretty personal too. So, you know, there's a lot of history out there. Okay. Let's see. We'll start with, can Rain tell us what her pin says on her shirt?
Oh. I've been trying to show it. It says love. It is the Coldplay logo. I got this a couple weeks after everything happened. There was a mini march that we had at the Pine Trails Park in Parkland to another nearby park that passes our school. We had our signs and everything, and we just spent the afternoon chanting, and that's where I got it.
Another question for the elected officials, and Tim just mentioned this in passing. Professional lobbyists obtain a lot of successes in Congress. Some examples are in here. As a congressperson, how do you experience these professional lobbyists? What is the key to their success?
I really think you ought to take that.
Well, almost everyone has a lobbyist on, believe it or not, probably in this room and in the country. If you belong to a church, a lot of them have people who work for them. If you're a teacher, if you're a worker, if you're an environmentalist, certainly most businesses, one way or another, have lobbyists. And it has a bad reputation, but they actually serve a very important function in the working of our government because you have a lot of competing interests. We're trying to do legislating, and we have hearings in order to deal with this issue where we'll invite people to come and testify with different perspectives, and a lot of them are lobbyists, but they're representing the interests of their group and saying how they will be hurt by something that another group is trying to do. And through that process, you can often work out accommodations that enable us to move forward. One of the reasons for gridlock is that people have been less willing to listen and to see if there's crossover in some areas where you can actually get something done because of some polarization in the country.
I think that the part that is not in the question, but it should be added, is that some of these lobby groups have a lot of money. And the way our system now works with recent Supreme Court decisions, you can basically, through political action committees and super PACs and other indirect ways, contribute a lot of money in a political race. And if these lobby groups, they can be on any side of an issue. Tim is right. I mean, they're not all, let's just say, lobbying on the gun issue. Some are environmental groups, some are union groups. But if they provide a lot of money to a member of Congress, it may skew the information that that person is willing to receive on either side of the issue and feed the partisanship that we have. I think that's fair.
Our two Parkland guests are lobbyists. They are trying to get changes in gun laws.
Good point.
The most effective lobbyists are citizens
Yeah.
Oh no.
who have particular...
It sounds ugly, but the whole point is you're educating Congress.
Yeah, and universities have lobbyists, school systems have lobbyists. And I think the truth is, if you're a representative, you are going to be very sensitive to businesses in your district. They employ people, they're important. I certainly, and it's not regardless of the money. Now, it is true that politics costs money, and there is a problem in both parties with people moving forward into leadership and
okay, we're not going to get to all this.
How much they raise from people of business before their committees, and that's something that desperately needs to be addressed. But the whole system of having freedom of association and being able to hire lawyers and other people to effectively address issues really is very important in the working of a complicated economy we have here in the United States.
Yes, Ted.
I would circle back. Two things. One, there is the issue of lobbyists, but it's the issue of money that's the overriding factor. There's too much of it. As the lead sponsor on the Democracy for All amendment to overturn Citizens United, which would actually get money out of politics, I spend a lot of time looking at all of the ways that money has a really pernicious influence on the way Washington works. All of that said, however, getting back to this issue, I mean, Eleanor is exactly right. There is no better advocate than someone who comes with a personal story. And there is no more powerful personal story than the stories that we're hearing out of Parkland. And so I understand the way that conventional wisdom has always been that historically on the gun issue, there are these single issue voters and they only care about gun rights. And the people who care about gun safety and all of the steps that we could take that are widely supported, but except in Congress, that those supporters of those bills and people who hold those positions, they've got lots of other things they care about too. I'm telling you from what I've seen after Stoneman Douglas, that is changing. There is a generation of young people for whom gun safety is now a defining issue. It will matter for them. If they're not old enough to vote yet, they're making it matter to their families. And I'm convinced that in the upcoming election, there are seats around the country where you're going to have to just decide which side you're on in this debate. And I wouldn't want to be on the side of the gun companies when I've got students like Rain coming in to represent the other side. And by the way, just one last thing about Parkland. It's a really powerful combination of the students and what some of the families who lost loved ones have done since the shooting has been remarkably powerful as well. Whether it's direct advocacy for changing the laws or foundations that have been started to focus on school safety, on mental health, whatever the issue is, there's an incredible amount of positive change that even with the grief that they're dealing with, that these families are also bringing.
Right. And so several of these questions are about how, and I asked this in a different way, about how you were empowered to act. And these focus on what role teachers played in empowering you. And in one case, this is an AP government teacher who asks, what advice does each of you have for teachers as to how best to empower our students to be motivated and effective advocates? So let's ask you, Sarah.
I think it's important for teachers to realize and be very aware that their students have a voice and they have opinions, and they're not just the kids who sit in front of you. They have valuable things to say and valuable thoughts and plans and hopes and dreams and all of those things that we try and foster in our students. But you know, when an event like this happens, you really see what these kids are made of. And to kind of piggyback on what Ted had said, I hope it's okay that I called you Ted. Okay.
Yeah,
what Ted said.
Don't call him Peter.
I won't.
Please don't call me Peter.
You know, what has come out of Parkland, I feel like it kind of came as a surprise to the rest of the nation that, you know, the Parkland kids are so well-spoken and articulate, and they've, you know, got it all together. But we knew that the whole time, because these are the same kids who will argue with you because they have an 89 and they want that 90. And, you know, they are very persistent in their arguments. They don't always get it, but, you know, the drive is there. So Delaney Tarr ate lunch in my classroom, was in my classroom every morning before school. Emma Gonzalez was in my journalism class as a junior. Like, I know these kids, and to see them have a voice, to see them have this platform, knowing that, you know, we as their teachers support them and encourage them and work with them, it's important for all teachers to do that, whether there's a huge issue like this or just something small happening at your school. This is what we're trained to do.
Good answer. So changing the subject a bit, we talked about the fact that social media is a driver of change that wasn't available to some of us back in the day, but it's here. And you said, Rain, you know, that you were very active on social media, both in that horrible classroom at that horrible moment that evening and since. So this question is about the perverse side. What about backlash on social media? And how does somebody like you deal with that? I assume there are people out there who you know, have counter messaging that is very personal to you, and that is probably very, you know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but how do you deal with that?
Well, as we were talking about earlier, actually, social media is a double-edged sword. I've received a lot more support than I have backlash, and then if I do get backlash, it's usually people then commenting under, this is a troll, or like supporting my side, even like just speaking for me almost. But for those people who do say that, it's just, I keep reading and I almost respond, and I'm just like, I don't have time. I don't have the energy for that, because that's not what I'm here to do. I'm not here to argue and speak over someone. I'm here to share my platform, share my views, and hope that everyone else can agree with me and see that my side or my beliefs are worth noticing. And going back to how we were talking about articulate speaking and things like that, I wasn't surprised at all, because I was in a classroom, David was also in the corner, and I saw him filming, and someone had a flashlight, and I was like, what is he doing? But then it just spurred into what it is now, and I'm going to go as well to the teacher thing. I'm sorry, but I think for teachers, it's just be there with your students. just uplift their voices as much as you can. My environmental teacher, she went with me to Tallahassee 4 or 5 days after everything happened to go and speak to our senators and our representatives. So just having her there and just building this stronger bond that I had with her, it kind of changed my whole entire relationship with her. But yeah, going back to backlash, I just choose to ignore it because I don't have the energy for it, and I don't think many of my
Well, it's a
peers
very,
have.
very mature reaction, and okay. In 1 minute, we'll do that. Fine. Let me just get to, and I do think that's a very mature reaction on your part. There's lots more to ask, but here's one. And again, this is to you, Rain. Do you worry that your teen supporters will lose interest in the cause that we're talking about, perhaps due to the distraction of social media and to other life experiences?
At first, I did actually a lot because, again, for us in Parkland, it was different because it was personal. But then slowly, I started getting messages from other students explaining how much we inspired them and motivated them. And then we went to a convention in California, and we were passing by, and we were looking at the journalism from other schools, and we saw that almost every single magazine or newspaper had a story talking about how they marched or how they protested or what they did, what their response was. So I don't think, if we continue to do what we're doing now, I don't think they'll lose interest as well, because they're looking to us, and we're continuing, and we're not going to stop, so I don't think they will either.
Can I just quickly speak to the assumption in that question that I think a lot of people had before this? I mean, the suggestion that, well, don't you think you're going to get distracted and sucked back into Snapchat and Snapchat? Plays to the narrative that existed before this happened, which is, oh, these high school kids, they're busy staring at their screens all day long. They're on Snapchat and Instagram. They're playing Fortnite. They're not paying attention to anything going on around them. And then this happened, and what we've realized is the whole time they were on their phones, they were building and participating in this community that gives them reach in their own local area and around the country and the world that we never could have imagined, which is why I'm confident they will not get sucked back into all those distractions.
Well, I want to call on Martin Frost in about 1 minute, but there's just one other question in a sort of different area, and I'm sorry if I'm not fair to all of you, but there are a lot of questions here. And that is whether, and maybe this is for you, Eleanor, whether the spillover of this, not that this issue is resolved, will shed some more light on the Black Lives Matter issue, which is not the same issue as school shootings, but it is an issue in the same genre. I mean, is there a spillover, do you think, and is it being helpful that these kids are out there in force talking about school violence?
The underlying issues are much the same. I mean, it's different group of people, right. But it's really, look who Black Lives Matter are. I mean, it's not my generation, and it's not quite Parkland generation, but it's young people who, again, are showing that there is a general understanding in this society that nothing happens without activism. Mm-hmm. That is the most important element of a democracy, that you think that what you are doing can somehow affect a very large issue. Now, for African Americans who were bona fide second-class citizens in this country, to take that step took an enormous sense that this country could change. And if that could happen in that generation that produced 3 great civil rights statutes, it does seem to me that it's an object lesson right. for every single generation of young people. So what have we seen now? It's gotten down to the youngest among us who have taken the most serious issue into their own hands, issues that generations before them have systematically failed, and gotten the attention of the country in a renewed interest, in a renewed effort to move perhaps the most difficult issue in our country today. Our hat has to be off to them.
Yes, yes it does. And I just want to make this point about activism, and then Martin, please come and talk about this issue that's in the same bandwidth, and maybe you can close this program. But while this is the most recent and possibly the most effective story about activism, activism has been going on in our country since its founding. Activists founded our country and wrote the founding documents, many of which are in this building. And we wouldn't have a country without activism, and we wouldn't have the change, the social change. Not enough, but we wouldn't have the social change we have, and women wouldn't have the right to vote, and women wouldn't be in Congress, that's for darn sure, without activism. So it's, what I like about this panel and thinking about it is, you know, there is a historical precedent. It didn't just start on Valentine's Day, not to minimize what you've done since Valentine's Day. And so I really applaud everyone who is on this panel and who is active, and everyone in this audience. Raise your hand if you're an activist. Raise your hand if you're not an activist. Okay, so I've made my point. Martin, why don't you, incoming President Martin Frost, close this down, but also make your point about this.
Yeah, Jane, first of all, this was an extraordinary panel, and I want to thank everybody for participating. And I want to take just a minute to share with you a personal example during my career as a congressman where citizen activism made a great deal of difference. Some years ago, there was a 9-year-old little girl who was kidnapped, molested, and murdered in my district. And as congressmen often do, I went out to express my sympathies. This was in a blue-collar neighborhood, relatively poor people. And I said, what can I do to help? And they said, well, Congressman, you can go back to Washington and make sure that this doesn't happen to other children. And they urged me to have a law passed increasing the penalties against child molesters, which I did, child predators. And then I worked with that group of citizens and with local media and law enforcement to create what now is the Amber Alert. The little girl's name was Amber Hagerman, and I was the author of the National Amber Alert legislation, which was because a group of citizens, average citizens, these weren't people with any money at all, came to their congressman and said, Congressman, could you make a difference? And fortunately, working with other members of Congress, I was able to do that. So there are a lot of examples. Everyone who's served has some degree of, has some kind of examples where the average citizen, not the moneyed people, made an impact on their career and on the people they represent. And again, I want to thank all of you for participating today. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.